Good evening, and welcome to Edward's Sleep Mysteries. I'm Edward, here to guide you gently toward rest. Sleep, I've found, is not something we rush into. It's something we drift toward. If you wish, tell me in the comments whether you listen until the end, or simply until sleep finds you. You're warmly invited to subscribe if these stories are part of your evenings. Now, settle back, and let the mystery soften into dreams. Chapter 1. A Town Preparing to Be Merry. There are towns in England which seem to have been fashioned expressly for the purpose of demonstrating that contentment need not be a grand affair, but may flourish quite comfortably in modest surroundings, among persons of ordinary means and unremarkable histories. Briarcombe was such a town. It lay nestled in a gentle valley, its brick cottages clustered about a high street of no particular distinction, its church spire rising with quiet confidence above rooftops that had weathered many winters without complaint. The place possessed neither the bustle of a market town nor the drowsy charm of a country village, but occupied instead that agreeable middle ground where neighbours knew one another by name. Tradesmen kept regular hours, and life proceeded with the steady rhythm of a clock that required winding only once a week. It was in the December of a year not long past that we find Briarcombe preparing, as it did each season, to observe Christmas with all the careful attention that such an occasion demands. The preparations were neither extravagant nor mean, but struck that perfect balance which the townspeople had learned to maintain in all their undertakings. Garlands of holly appeared in shop windows, their berries gleaming like small rubies against the dark leaves. The butcher displayed his finest geese, their plump forms hanging in rows that spoke of prosperous farms and well-fed birds. The confectioner arranged marzipan fruits in pyramids that seemed almost too pretty to disturb, while the draper unfurled bolts of ribbon in colours that would not have shamed a London establishment. The assembly room, which stood at the far end of the high street and served on various occasions as a place for meetings, concerts, and the settling of civic matters, had been reserved for the annual Christmas celebration. His event, which had become something of a tradition over the past decade, was understood by all to be not merely an evening of entertainment, but a confirmation of Briarcombe's unity and goodwill. It was the moment when the town looked at itself in the mirror, so to speak, and found the reflection entirely satisfactory. Among those who moved through these preparations with particular purpose was Mr. Oliver Finch, whose name, modest though it was, appeared on various documents of importance to the town. He served as bookkeeper for the town trust, a position that required neither brilliance nor boldness, but rather a steady hand, an honest disposition, and the ability to make columns of figures behave themselves. Mr. Finch was a man of perhaps 50 years, though his face carried so little of either youth's eagerness or age's resignation that one might have placed him anywhere between 40 and 60 without being demonstrably wrong. His hair, once brown, had retreated to a dignified grey at the temples. His spectacles sat upon his nose with the air of having found their proper home. His coat, though not new, was brushed and mended with care, and his boots, though modest, were always clean. He was not a man whom children would remember, or whom gossips would discuss, or whom ambitious mothers would consider for their daughters. Yet he was the sort of man upon whom a community quietly depends. When the church needed its accounts reconciled, Mr. Finch was summoned. When a dispute arose over the division of common funds, Mr. Finch was consulted. When someone required a letter written with particular delicacy, Mr. Finch obliged. He performed these services without fanfare, asked no payment beyond his modest salary, and seemed to derive his satisfaction from the simple fact of being useful. On the morning of the 20th of December, Mr. Finch could be observed walking down the high street with his characteristic unhurried gait, pausing here to exchange greetings with the baker, there to acknowledge the postmistress, and finally stopping before the assembly room, where preparations for the celebration were well underway. It was here that he encountered Mrs. Helena Grant, whose energy and organisational talents had made her the natural leader of such festivities. Mrs. Grant was a woman of formidable accomplishments disguised by an appearance of perfect amiability. She was handsome rather than beautiful, her face animated by intelligence and goodwill, her figure suggesting prosperity without excess. She had been widowed some years earlier, her late husband having been a solicitor of respectable practice, and she had channeled her considerable vitality into civic improvement. Under her guidance, the annual Christmas celebration had grown from a simple supper into an occasion of genuine elegance featuring music, speeches, and a general atmosphere of refined enjoyment. "Mr. Finch," she called out, catching sight of him through the open doorway. "How fortunate that you should appear at precisely this moment. I require your opinion on a matter of some delicacy." Mr. Finch entered the assembly room, removing his hat as he did so, and found Mrs. Grant standing amid a controlled chaos of garlands, candles, and chairs in various stages of arrangement. Two younger women, evidently pressed into service, were attempting to hang greenery from the ceiling beams, while a third consulted a list with the furrowed concentration of one engaged in matters of state. "I am entirely at your service, madam," said Mr. Finch, with the quiet courtesy that characterized all his dealings. Mrs. Grant gestured toward a table laden with papers. "It concerns the toast I intend to propose during the celebration. I wish to honour those whose contributions have made Briarcombe what it is today. The sentiment is simple enough, yet I find myself uncertain of the precise wording." "You have such a gift for language, Mr. Finch. Might you review what I have written and offer your thoughts?" Mr. Finch approached the table and took up the paper she indicated. His eyes moved across the lines with the careful attention he brought to all written matters. The toast, as Mrs. Grant had composed it, was indeed simple, expressing gratitude to those whose sacrifices and dedication had built the town's prosperity. The language was generous without being flowery, sincere without being maudlin. "It is admirably expressed," Mr. Finch said after a moment. "I can find no fault with either the sentiment or the style." "You hesitate," Mrs. Grant observed, with the perceptiveness that made her such an effective organizer of people. "I hear it in your voice, Mr. Finch. Is there something that troubles you?" Mr. Finch looked up from the paper, his expression thoughtful. "Not troubles, precisely. I merely wonder whether we ought to be specific about which sacrifices we mean to honour. Gratitude, when too general, sometimes fails to find its proper object." Mrs. Grant considered this, her brow furrowing slightly. "But to be specific might seem to exclude others. I wish the toast to embrace all who have contributed." "Quite so," Mr. Finch replied, returning the paper to her. "You're entirely right, of course. It is well as it stands." Yet as he took his leave and continued his walk through town, Mr. Finch carried with him a faint unease, like a man who senses rain though the sky remains clear. He could not have explained its source, nor did he attempt to. He simply tucked it away in that quiet corner of his mind where he kept such impressions, and proceeded with his day. The town continued its preparations. The Reverend Samuel Hart, a man of gentle disposition and generous faith, rehearsed his choir through carols that had been sung in Briarcombe for generations. The shopkeepers polished their windows to an extra brightness. Children whispered of gifts and counted the days with that peculiar mixture of impatience and delight that belongs exclusively to the young. And as the sun set on that December evening, painting the sky in shades of rose and amber, Briarcombe settled into the comfortable anticipation of a celebration that would, it was assumed, confirm everything the town believed about itself. That this assumption would prove both true and profoundly inadequate was something no one yet suspected, though Mr. Oliver Finch, walking home through the gathering dusk, felt that strange unease settle a bit more heavily upon his shoulders, like snow that has not yet decided whether to fall. Chapter 10, When the Music Found Its Measure Again. There is a particular quality to the settling that occurs after truth has been spoken and acknowledged, a quality not unlike the subsidence of earth after a storm, when the ground, though altered, finds a new stability that may prove more lasting than what preceded it. In the weeks following the town meeting, Briarcombe underwent just such a settling, its rhythms resuming their familiar patterns, yet carrying within them a subtle difference that those with ears to hear might recognise as the sound of a community learning to live more honestly with its own history. The Brennan Emergency Fund, as it came to be known, was established with substantial initial contribution from the town trust, supplemented by private donations that arrived with surprising frequency. Mrs. Grant took charge of its administration, approaching the task with a thoroughness that suggested she had found in this work a form of penance. Though the word itself was never spoken, she created procedures designed to ensure swift response to genuine need, eliminating the delays that had once allowed bureaucracy to substitute for compassion. Mr. Lyle, for his part, proposed and personally funded a small plaque to be placed in the assembly room, bearing a simple inscription that honoured the Brennan family and acknowledged the community's failure to assist them when help had been most needed. The proposal met with unanimous approval, and the plaque was installed with quiet ceremony on a February afternoon when winter's grip had at last begun to loosen. Reverend Hart incorporated the story into his Lenten sermons, drawing from it lessons about the difference between intentions and actions, about the ease with which good people might collectively accomplish what no single individual would countenance alone. His words were gentle rather than harsh, for he understood that his congregation had already been sufficiently convicted by their own consciences and required guidance toward redemption rather than further condemnation. Miss Cole, who had carried her lonely knowledge for so many years, found an unexpected relief in its being shared. She no longer bore the burden of correcting comfortable assumptions, for the assumptions themselves had been publicly dismantled. She took to visiting the plaque regularly, and those who observed her standing before it noted that her expression, while still sorrowful, carried a quality of peace it had previously lacked. As for Mr. Finch, he returned to his customary routines with the same quiet efficiency that had always characterised his work. Yet those who knew him well, and there were perhaps a handful who could make such a claim, perceived that something in him had lightened. He had carried the weight of witnessed injustice for years, maintaining his small acts of anonymous charity while watching the town construct its comfortable narrative. Now that burden had been shared, and though he remained as honest and unassuming as ever, there was in his bearing a quality that suggested satisfaction with duty properly discharged. The first recipient of assistance from the Brennan Fund was a widow whose husband had died suddenly, leaving her with 3 young children and debts she could not hope to satisfy on her own. The help came swiftly, without extended deliberation or onerous conditions, and it proved sufficient to prevent her from having to make the same desperate choices the Brennans had faced. When she expressed her gratitude to Mrs. Grant, tears streaming down her face, Mrs. Grant embraced her and said only, "We should have learned this lesson years ago. I am grateful we have learned it now." Winter gave way to spring in the manner of English seasons, which is to say gradually and with frequent reversals, so that one day might bring sunshine warm enough to coax crocuses from the earth, while the next brought frost sufficient to remind them of their presumption. The town's gardens began their annual resurrection, and shopkeepers replaced winter goods with spring offerings, and life proceeded with that combination of permanence and change that marks the passage of time in settled communities. It was on an April morning, when the world was green with new growth, and the air carried the scent of apple blossoms, that Mr. Finch received a letter bearing a Nottingham postmark. His landlady, Mrs. Pettigrew, brought it to him at breakfast with an expression of curiosity, for Mr. Finch rarely received personal correspondence. He opened it with his usual care, extracting 2 sheets of paper covered in a feminine hand that showed the effects of age and hard use, but retained nonetheless a certain elegance of formation. The letter was from Sarah Brennan. She had learned of the town meeting, she wrote, through a circuitous route involving Thomas Welby's network of church connections. Someone in Nottingham who knew someone in Leicester who maintained correspondence with the sexton in Briarcombe had passed along the news, and it had eventually found its way to her. She wished to express her gratitude, not for the practical measures Briarcombe had taken, though those were worthy, but for the simple acknowledgement of what had occurred. "We did not leave in anger," she wrote, "but in sorrow, and it has grieved me all these years to think that Briarcombe might remember us, if it remembered us at all, as ungrateful or unworthy. To know that the truth has been spoken, and that our suffering has been acknowledged, brings a peace I had not dared to hope for. We are well enough, my husband and I, though age and hard work have taken their toll. Our children are grown now, with children of their own, and they are good people who bear no bitterness toward the place of their birth. I have told them of your town meeting, and of Mr. Finch's courage in speaking truth, and they have wept with me, not from grief, but from a kind of healing we had thought impossible. She concluded by asking Mr. Finch to convey her blessing to Briarcombe, and particularly to those who had found the strength to acknowledge what had been done and left undone. Tell them, she wrote, that forgiveness given freely is returned freely, and that I hold no ill will toward any soul in that place. Tell them that they have honoured us more through honest acknowledgement than they could ever have done through comfortable silence. And tell them that Christmas, rightly observed, does indeed invite us to tend carefully to the hurts we left behind, and that in this tending healing becomes possible. Mr. Finch read the letter multiple times, then carried it with him to his office where he placed it carefully in a folder marked with the current year. That evening he called upon Mrs. Grant and Reverend Hart and shared its contents with them. Mrs. Grant wept openly, and Reverend Hart sat in silence for a long while before speaking. "We are forgiven," he said at last, "though we had no right to expect it. We are given a grace we did not earn. This is a gift, and we must honour it by ensuring that others in future receive the help we failed to provide." Word of Sarah Brennan's letter spread through the town with the quiet efficiency that characterises the distribution of news in close communities. Those who heard it received it variously, some with relief, some with renewed shame, some with quiet determination to do better. But all understood it as a kind of benediction, an absolution that made possible a future unburdened by unacknowledged past failures. As spring deepened into summer, Briarcombe settled into its new understanding of itself. It remained the same town in most respects, its shops and houses unchanged, its routines and rhythms familiar. Yet something essential had shifted. The comfortable narrative had been replaced by a more complex truth, and the community had discovered that it could live with that truth, could even grow stronger through acknowledging it. Mr. Finch, walking home one evening through streets bathed in the golden light of a summer sunset, reflected that mysteries, when properly understood, were not merely puzzles to be solved, but invitations to deeper comprehension. The mystery of Briarcombe had not been who had wronged the Brennans, for everyone and no one had done so. It had been whether a community could face its own failures without fracturing, whether truth could be spoken without destroying the bonds that held neighbours together. The answer, he had learned, was yes, but only if truth was spoken with compassion rather than condemnation, and only if those who heard it possessed sufficient courage to accept it rather than retreating into defensiveness or denial. The music of community life, which the Christmas toast had disrupted, had indeed found its measure again. But it was a richer measure now, deepened by minor notes of acknowledged sorrow, strengthened by harmonies of shared responsibility, and made more beautiful by the knowledge that even failures honestly confronted could become foundations for better choices yet to come. And somewhere in Nottingham, an elderly woman who had once departed in the night, asking her husband to remember kindly those who had failed her, now knew that she had been remembered, truly and honestly remembered, and in that remembrance had found a peace that both she and the town that had wronged her so gently had earned through the simple grace of speaking and receiving truth. Thus do we learn, if we are wise, that celebrations do not wound on their own, but reveal what was never healed, and that Christmas, rightly observed, invites us not only to remember our joys, but to tend carefully to the hurts we left behind, in the faith that tending brings healing, and healing makes possible a harmony more lasting than any that rests upon convenient forgetfulness. Chapter 9. A Truth Spoken Without Heat. The assembly room filled slowly on the evening of the town meeting, its occupants arriving in the unhurried manner of people attending to civic duty rather than pleasure, yet arriving nonetheless with the conscientiousness that marks a community that takes its collective responsibilities with appropriate seriousness. The chairs had been arranged in neat rows, and the platform at the front bore a simple table where the trust officers would sit to conduct the evening's business. Mrs. Grant arrived early, as was her custom, greeting each attendee with words of welcome and small observations about the weather, which had turned milder in recent days, suggesting that winter might at last be loosening its grip. Mr. Lyle took his customary seat near the front, his ledger tucked under his arm, prepared to offer commentary on any financial matters that might require his expertise. Reverend Hart positioned himself near the door, the better to welcome latecomers and ensure that no one felt themselves excluded from the proceedings. Miss Cole slipped in quietly and chose a seat toward the back, her expression suggesting she expected little from the evening, but felt obliged to attend nonetheless. Thomas Welby too was present, though he remained standing along the wall, as though reluctant to claim space that might be needed by others of greater consequence. Mr. Finch arrived last, carrying his satchel with its burden of ledgers and carefully prepared remarks. He took his place at the table on the platform, arranging his materials with the methodical precision that characterized all his actions, aware that perhaps 24 pairs of eyes watched these preparations with varying degrees of interest. The meeting commenced with the usual formalities. Minutes from the previous gathering were read and approved. Routine matters of town maintenance were discussed and dispensed with. A question arose concerning the repair of a fence bordering the common land, and this occasioned a brief debate that concluded with the sensible decision to seek additional estimates before committing to any particular course of action. Then came the moment for Mr. Finch to present his financial report, and the room settled into that particular quality of polite attention which people reserve for information they know to be necessary but do not expect to find engaging. Mr. Finch rose from his chair with deliberate slowness, gathering his papers, and when he spoke, his voice carried clearly through the room despite its lack of volume or force. "Friends and neighbours," he began, "I have prepared for you the customary accounting of our trust's financial position over the year just concluded. The figures show a balance that is healthy, expenditures that have been prudent, and receipts that have met expectations. You will find the details in the written report I shall distribute at the conclusion of this meeting." He paused, and in that pause, something in the quality of his stillness suggested that the customary portion of his remarks had concluded, and something less customary was about to follow. "However," he continued, "I have been reflecting of late upon another kind of accounting, one that does not appear in ledgers but which demands our attention nonetheless. I speak of the accounting we owe to ourselves as a community, the examination of choices made and consequences endured." Mrs. Grant, who had been nodding along with his opening remarks, now looked up with an expression of mild surprise. Mr. Lyle shifted in his seat, his brow furrowing slightly. Around the room, others who had been only partially attentive now focused their regard more fully upon the modest figure at the front. "Some weeks ago," Mr. Finch went on, his tone remaining gentle and conversational, "during our Christmas celebration, Mrs. Grant proposed a toast to those whose sacrifices built our town. It was a generous sentiment, sincerely offered, and yet it touched upon something that many of us have preferred not to examine too closely. It reminded us, whether we wish to be reminded or not, that our present comfort rests in part upon foundations we have chosen not to scrutinize." He reached into his satchel and withdrew Sarah Brennan's letter, holding it as one might hold a precious document deserving of careful regard. "I have here a letter," he said, "written some years ago by a woman named Sarah Brennan. Some of you will remember the family. Others may have allowed the memory to fade. Mrs. Brennan wrote to request assistance during a period of hardship. The letter is dignified, modest, and expresses confidence that this community would respond as neighbours ought to respond to neighbours in need." The silence in the room had changed quality, becoming heavier, charged with recognition and unease. The trust received this letter and noted it for discussion. Mr. Finch continued. That discussion proceeded with all due consideration of precedent, procedure, and principle. Questions were raised, as was proper. Concerns were expressed, as was reasonable. And while these deliberations continued, the Brennan family waited. They waited through December, through January, through the depths of a winter that tested them beyond their capacity to endure. He set down the letter and looked out at the assembled townspeople, his gaze moving from face to face with neither accusation nor condemnation, but rather with an expression of sorrowful understanding. "I do not stand here to assign blame," he said quietly. "Indeed, in all my inquiries I have found no villain. Mr. Lyle acted according to his principles of sound stewardship. Mrs. Grant sought to balance immediate need against long-term sustainability. Reverend Hart counselled prudence and self-reliance. Each of you, had you been consulted, would likely have raised similar considerations. We are none of us cruel, we are none of us deliberately hard-hearted." He paused, allowing this truth to settle before continuing. "Yet while we deliberated, a family suffered. While we weighed principles, children went hungry. While we considered precedent, parents faced the choice between dignity and survival. And when at last they departed, leaving in the night because they could no longer bear the shame of staying, we told ourselves comfortable stories. We said they had found opportunity elsewhere. We said they had family in Manchester or Liverpool. We said they had chosen to leave." Mrs. Grant's face had grown pale. Mr. Lyle was staring at his hands. Reverend Hart's head was bowed as though in prayer. "I have learned," Mr. Finch said, "that the Brennans went to Leicester, then to Nottingham. James found factory work that damaged his health. Sarah took in sewing. The children lost years of schooling. They survived, but survival is not the same as flourishing, and the cost of that survival was extracted in ways we shall never fully comprehend because we chose not to witness it." He picked up the letter once more, regarding it with an expression of infinite tenderness. Before she left, Sarah Brennan asked her husband to remember Briarcombe kindly. She said, "They meant no harm," and she was right. We meant no harm, but harm was done nonetheless, and the fact that it arose from collective hesitation rather than individual cruelty does not make it less real or less requiring of our acknowledgement. The room remained silent, but it was no longer the silence of polite attention. It was the silence of conscience awakened, of comfortable assumptions disturbed, of truth that could no longer be avoided. "I do not know," Mr. Finch said, his voice dropping almost to a whisper, "whether we can make amends to the Brennans themselves. Too many years have passed, and I have no certain knowledge of where they now reside, but I believe we can honour their memory and honour the truth of what occurred by ensuring that no family in similar circumstances must wait while we debate whether compassion is prudent or whether need has been sufficiently proven." He sat down, having said what needed to be said, and the room remained quiet for a long moment, as though the assembled townspeople required time to absorb the weight of what they had heard. Then Mrs. Grant rose, her composure maintained though her voice trembled slightly. "Mr. Finch is right," she said simply. "We meant no harm, but we caused it nonetheless. I move that we establish immediately a fund for emergency assistance, to be deployed without delay when need is demonstrated, and that we name it in memory of the Brennan family, so that we might never forget what our hesitation cost them." "I second the motion," said Reverend Hart quietly, and there was in his voice a note of something that might have been relief, as though he had been waiting years for permission to acknowledge what he had always known, but found too painful to express. The vote, when it came, was unanimous. Chapter 8. What had been endured quietly. The human capacity for self-deception is matched only by the human capacity for eventual recognition, and the distance between these two states is often measured not in miles, but in moments of unavoidable truth. For Briarcombe, such a moment was approaching, though most of its inhabitants remained as yet unaware of its advance, much as one might remain unaware of dawn's approach while still wrapped in the comfortable darkness of night. Mr. Finch, having assembled the fragments of the Brennan story into a coherent whole, found himself in the peculiar position of possessing knowledge that demanded expression, yet resisted easy articulation. He was not by nature a confrontational man, nor did he harbour any desire to stand in judgment over his neighbours. Yet neither could he simply return this knowledge to the obscurity from which he had retrieved it, like a book reshuffled after reading. The truth, once fully apprehended, exerts its own pressure toward revelation. For several days he wrestled with this dilemma, going about his ordinary duties with his usual quiet efficiency while his mind turned over the question of what, if anything, ought to be done. He attended to the trust accounts, reconciled the year-end figures, prepared reports that would be presented at the upcoming town meeting, and all the while, beneath these mechanical actions, a deeper consideration proceeded. It was during this period of contemplation that Mr. Finch began to perceive connections he had not previously noticed, threads that linked past events to present circumstances in ways that cast both in an altered light. The assembly room, for instance, which had been improved with funds that might have assisted the Brennans, now stood as a monument to a particular choice. Each time it hosted a gathering, it silently proclaimed that brick and mortar had been valued above flesh and blood, though no one consciously acknowledged this proclamation. Similarly, the roads that had been resurfaced that same year bore constant traffic, their smooth stones testament to civic improvement purchased at what cost exactly? Mr. Lyle drove his cart over them daily, conducting the business that had expanded in the wake of the Brennans' departure. Mrs. Grant walked them to her various charitable activities, never connecting the comfort beneath her feet to the discomfort that had enabled it. Yet it would be unjust to suggest that these individuals were uniquely callous or deliberately blind. They were, Mr. Finch had come to understand, simply human in the most ordinary sense of that word. They possessed the common human talent for arranging their memories and perceptions in ways that preserved their self-regard, and the common human weakness of confusing sincerity with righteousness. It was on a Thursday afternoon, while reviewing correspondence in his office, that Mr. Finch discovered among the old letters one that had been misfiled, dated from the winter of the Brennans' departure. It was addressed to the town trust, written in a hand that Mr. Finch recognised from church records as belonging to Sarah Brennan herself. The letter was brief and dignified, requesting assistance for her family's immediate needs while her husband sought new employment. It outlined their circumstances without pleading, stated their case without embellishment, and concluded with an expression of confidence that the community would extend the help that neighbours ought to extend to neighbours in times of trouble. The letter bore a date in December, and according to the trust minutes, it had been received and noted for discussion at the next meeting, which had been scheduled for 2 weeks hence. 2 weeks during which children went hungry and parents faced impossible choices. 2 weeks which had stretched into months of deliberation that outlasted the family's ability to wait. 2 weeks that demonstrated with perfect clarity how reasonable procedures properly followed could produce unreasonable outcomes. Mr. Finch sat with this letter for some time, reading it multiple times, noting the care with which Sarah Brennan had chosen her words, the dignity she had maintained even in extremity. He thought of Thomas Welby's account of her final words, asking her husband to remember Briarcombe kindly, and he marvelled at the grace that could forgive what he himself was struggling to accept. That evening he found himself walking without conscious destination through the town, his steps carrying him past familiar landmarks that now bore new significance. He passed the house where the Brennans had lived, now occupied by a young couple recently married, their windows glowing with lamplight and contentment. He passed the shop where James Brennan had been employed before its failure, now reopened under different ownership and doing brisk trade. And he passed the assembly room, where preparations were underway for the town meeting, scheduled for the following week. Through the windows he could see Mrs. Grant directing the arrangement of chairs, her capable hands gesturing, her voice carrying the note of authority that came naturally to her. She caught sight of him and waved, a gesture of friendly recognition, and he waved back, aware that she had no notion of the knowledge he carried, or the use to which he intended to put it. As January progressed toward its conclusion, Mr. Finch began to prepare his report for the town meeting with unusual care. It was customary for him to present a summary of the trust's financial position, noting receipts and expenditures, explaining any variances from projected figures, and offering recommendations for the year ahead. This report was typically received with polite attention and prompt approval, being the sort of necessary but unremarkable business that communities must conduct to maintain their operations. This year, however, Mr. Finch determined that his report would serve a dual purpose. Alongside the expected numerical accounting, he would offer what might be termed a moral accounting, a reckoning not merely of pounds and pence, but of choices and consequences. He would do so carefully, without accusation or theatricality, but with sufficient clarity that those present could not avoid confronting what had been done in their collective name. He drafted and redrafted his remarks, seeking language that would convey truth without cruelty, that would prompt reflection without inducing defensiveness. It was delicate work, requiring the same precision he brought to balancing ledgers, though the stakes seemed considerably higher. Numbers, when improperly recorded, could be corrected with a stroke of the pen. Moral failings, once acknowledged, demanded responses of a different order entirely. On the evening before the town meeting, Mr. Finch sat in his modest lodgings, his final draft before him, and allowed himself to consider the possibility that his effort would prove futile. People might refuse to hear what he had to say. They might dismiss his account as exaggerated or irrelevant. They might acknowledge the facts while denying their significance. The human capacity for rationalization, he knew, was nearly limitless when self-interest was engaged. Yet he thought again of Sarah Brennan's letter, of her quiet dignity and her faith that neighbours would help neighbours. He thought of Thomas Welby's patient witness, of Miss Cole's lonely remembrance, of his own small anonymous gifts that had eased, but not prevented suffering. And he thought of the children who had sung in the church choir with empty bellies, their sweet voices lifted in praise while the town debated procedures. Some debts, he reflected, could not be settled, but they could at least be acknowledged. Some failures, though irreversible, could inform future choices, and some silences, maintained too long, created voids that eventually demanded filling, whether through deliberate action or eventual collapse. Mr. Finch extinguished his lamp and prepared for bed, knowing that tomorrow would bring either the beginning of Briarcomb's reckoning or merely another postponement of it. He had done what he could to prepare the ground for truth. Whether that ground would prove fertile or barren remained to be discovered. Sleep, when it came, brought dreams of winter roads and departing carts, of children's voices singing in empty churches, and of a woman's grace in forgiving those who had, without intending it, forced her family into exile. And in those dreams, Mr. Finch carried the weight of all he had learned, preparing to share that weight with others who had thus far avoided bearing it, in the hope that burden shared might yet lead to burden lifted. If not for the Brennans themselves, then for those who might in future find themselves similarly positioned, waiting for help that ought to come but might not, depending on whether communities learned from their failures or simply repeated them with slight variations. The dawn would tell. Chapter 7. Winters Remembered by the Few. There are moments in every inquiry when the accumulation of fragments suddenly resolves into a coherent whole, much as a landscape obscured by morning fog reveals its true contours when the sun burns through the mist. For Mr. Finch, this moment arrived on a grey afternoon in early January, when he found himself in conversation with old Thomas Welby, who had served as sexton of Briarcombe Church for more years than most could readily count. Mr. Welby was one of those individuals who occupy the margins of community life, yet observe its centre with remarkable clarity. His duties required him to be present for births, marriages, and deaths, to maintain the fabric of the church building, and to know the churchyard's inhabitants as intimately as he knew the living parishioners. He was a man of few words but deep memory, and what he chose to share often carried the weight of long consideration. Mr. Finch encountered him in the churchyard, in the hour where the old sexton was engaged in the winter work of clearing leaves and debris from the pathways. Despite the cold, Mr. Welby worked with the steady rhythm of one who has learned to pace himself for endurance rather than speed, and who finds in physical labour a meditation more valuable than idleness. Mr. Welby, Mr. Finch greeted him. I wonder if I might impose upon your time for a moment. The sexton straightened, easing his back with a hand that had known decades of such work. "No imposition, Mr. Finch. These leaves will wait. They have infinite patience, unlike people." They walked together to a bench that stood beneath a yew tree of considerable antiquity, its branches spreading overhead like a sheltering canopy. Mr. Finch settled himself carefully, for the bench was cold, and waited for Mr. Welby to join him at his own deliberate pace. "I have been learning about the winter when the Brennan family left Briarcombe," Mr. Finch began, choosing his words with care. "I understand it was particularly harsh." Mr. Welby nodded slowly, his eyes focusing on some middle distance where memory lived. "Aye, that it was. One of those winters that starts early and grips hard. The snow came before Advent and stayed through Epiphany. Pipes froze. Coal ran scarce, and those without means felt it most severely. The Brennans were among those without means. They were, Mr. Welby confirmed. I remember seeing young Mrs. Brennan at the church, attending services even when the cold was fierce. Proud woman she was, though not proud in the manner that refuses help. Proud in the way that tries to maintain dignity even when circumstances strip most of it away. She would wear the same worn cloak each Sunday, but she kept it clean and mended, and she kept her children clean too, though I could see the effort it cost her. He paused, his weathered hands folding together, as though in prayer or perhaps merely for warmth. The children sang in the choir that winter. Reverend Hart had just arrived, full of ideas about expanding the musical offerings. 3 Brennan children, their voices sweet as bells. But as the winter deepened, I noticed they grew quieter, more listless. The smallest one, a girl of perhaps 6 years, fainted during one service. Not enough food, you understand. The body can only sustain so much deprivation before it begins to fail. Mr. Finch felt something tighten in his chest, a physical manifestation of moral outrage tempered by sorrow. And the town was debating whether to assist them. "Debating," Mr. Welby repeated, and the word carried in his mouth the bitter taste of ashes. "Yes, there was much debate. I heard fragments of it, you understand. People speak freely around a sexton, as they do around servants. They forget we have ears and memories. The debates were very fine and philosophical, questions of precedent and procedure, of fairness and sustainability. All very reasonable, I'm sure, for those conducting them in warm parlours with full bellies. You disapproved." "My approval was not sought and would not have been heeded if offered," Mr. Welby said, with the calm acceptance of one who had long ago learned the limits of his influence. "But I did what I could, small things, a basket of vegetables left by their door with no name attached. Coal from the church stores diverted quietly. Reverend Hart knew, I think, but he said nothing. Perhaps he felt it balanced somehow against his counsel of prudence to the trust. Mr. Finch thought of his own small anonymous contributions, recorded in the ledgers as miscellaneous charitable gifts. Such assistance must have helped. It kept them alive through December, Mr. Welby said, but it could not restore James Brennan's employment, could not pay their rent, could not provide the certainty they needed that the community would support them until they could support themselves again. They needed more than bread and coal, they needed hope, and hope was the one thing that the town's deliberations had thoroughly extinguished. A wind had risen, carrying with it the promise of more cold to come. The branches of the yew tree moved overhead, their ancient wood creaking with a sound like distant conversation. "I was present the night they left," Mr. Welby said quietly. "I keep watch sometimes at night, you see. Old habits from my younger days, and this church is peaceful when the world sleeps. I saw them loading what few possessions they had into a borrowed cart. The children were confused, asking questions their parents could not properly answer. Where were they going? Why in the night? When would they return? And James Brennan, Mr. Finch, prompted gently. What did he say? He said nothing at all, Mr. Welby replied. But Mrs. Brennan, as she lifted the smallest child into the cart, looked back at the church one last time. I was standing in shadow, and I do not believe she saw me. But I heard her speak to her husband. She said, 'Remember it kindly, James. They meant no harm.' That was all. They meant no harm." The words hung in the cold air between them, an epitaph for good intentions that had somehow produced suffering nonetheless. "Did you ever learn what became of them?" Mr. Finch asked. "I made inquiries," Mr. Welby said. "Quiet ones, through my own channels. The network of sextons and church workers extends throughout England, you know. We share information as others share gossip. I learnt they went to Leicester first, then to Nottingham. James found work in a factory there, hard work that damaged his health. Mrs. Brennan took in sewing. The children went without schooling for a time. They survived, Mr. Finch, but they did not prosper as Mr. Lyle likes to imagine. They survived in the manner that people do when they have no other choice, which is to say they paid a price for it that cannot be measured in pounds and pence." Mr. Finch absorbed this information into evidence, adding it to the picture that had been forming in his mind. The Brennans had not vanished into comfortable obscurity. They had descended into the anonymous struggle of the urban poor, where survival itself constituted success and dignity became an unaffordable luxury. "Why have you not shared this knowledge?" he asked. "Surely it would have corrected the town's comfortable assumptions." Mr. Welby smiled, a sad expression that contained more wisdom than bitterness. "To what end? To make people feel guilty about decisions already made? To disrupt the peace they have constructed? I am an old man, Mr. Finch, and I have learned that truth does not always serve the good as clearly as we might wish. Sometimes it merely inflicts pain without purpose. Yet you have told me." "I have told you," Mr. Welby acknowledged, "because I perceive that you are not seeking information merely for its own sake, but because you intend to do something with it, and because I think perhaps the time has come for Briarcombe to reckon honestly with what it allowed to happen. Not for punishment, but for understanding. Not to assign blame, but to prevent such failures of compassion from recurring." They sat together in silence for a time, two men of modest station who had witnessed from the margins what those at the centre had preferred not to see. The winter afternoon was drawing toward its early conclusion, the sun already lowering toward the horizon, though the hour was barely past 3. "Thank you," Mr. Finch said at last, rising from the bench. "You have given me what I needed, though I confess I am not entirely certain what to do with it." "You will know when the moment arrives," Mr. Welby said. "Truth has a way of finding its proper expression when the time is right." Mr. Finch walked slowly back through the town, past shops beginning to light their lamps against the gathering dusk, past neighbours exchanging evening greetings, past all the ordinary commerce of community life, and he carried with him, the image of a family departing in the night, and a woman's grace in asking her husband to remember kindly those who had failed them so completely. They meant no harm. It was true, and yet it was also insufficient. Harm had been done nonetheless, and the fact that it arose from inaction rather than action, from collective hesitation rather than individual cruelty, did not make it any less real or any less requiring of acknowledgement. Chapter 6. The Stories People Needed to Believe. The first day of the new year dawned clear and cold, the kind of morning when frost transforms the ordinary landscape into something approaching the magical, coating every twig and blade of grass with crystals that catch the light like scattered diamonds. Briarcombe woke slowly to this transformed world, its inhabitants emerging from their homes with the careful optimism that belongs to fresh beginnings, though whether the year ahead would prove kind or harsh remained, as always, a matter for Providence to determine. Mr. Finch rose early, as was his custom, and attended to his morning ablutions with the methodical precision that characterised all his actions. His lodgings, though modest, were maintained in good order, and his landlady, Mrs. Pettigrew, a widow of advancing years and unfailing punctuality, had already prepared his breakfast by the time he descended to the small dining room. "A new year, Mr. Finch," she observed, pouring his tea with the steadiness of long practice. "I trust it brings you health and contentment." "I am grateful for the wish, Mrs. Pettigrew," he replied, accepting the cup. though I confess I find myself preoccupied with matters belonging more properly to the old year than the new. The past has a way of lingering, she said, a sentiment delivered with the philosophical air of one who had accumulated sufficient years to speak with authority on such subjects, particularly when it has not been properly attended to. It was a shrewd observation, though whether Mrs. Pettigrew intended it as such, or merely offered a general truth, Mr. Finch could not determine. He ate his breakfast in contemplative silence, and then made his way to the small office he maintained for the conduct of trust business, a room situated above the apothecary's shop and reached by means of an exterior staircase that creaked in a manner suggesting imminent collapse without ever actually achieving it. The office, like Mr. Finch himself, was organised without ostentation. Ledgers lined one wall, their spines labelled in his neat hand. A desk stood before the window, positioned to catch the morning light. A single chair for visitors completed the furnishings, for Mr. Finch had never sought to impress those who called upon him, preferring efficiency to display. It was here, surrounded by the documented history of Briarcombe's civic transactions, that Mr. Finch spent the morning examining records from the period of the Brennan family's residence. The ledgers told their own story, one written in numbers rather than words, but no less eloquent for that. He traced the flow of funds designated for general assistance, noting when they had been discussed, when they had been deferred, and finally when they had been redirected to other purposes entirely. The assembly room improvements showed as a substantial expenditure in the spring of the year the Brennans had departed. The road resurfacing followed in summer. Both projects were noted with satisfaction in the trust minutes, accompanied by self-congratulatory language about prudent stewardship and community benefit. What the ledgers did not show, because numbers cannot capture such things, was the slow erosion of a family's dignity as they waited for help that never arrived. They did not record the conversations in which reasonable men found reasonable objections to immediate action. They did not preserve the moment when James Brennan realised that his fellow townsmen valued smooth roads more than his children's welfare. Yet even in their numerical austerity, the ledgers revealed something of importance. Tucked among the larger entries recorded in Mr. Finch's own hand were several small disbursements noted simply as miscellaneous charitable gifts. They were modest sums, the sort that might escape notice among grander expenditures, but their timing was significant. They coincided exactly with the period of the Brennans' greatest need. Mr. Finch sat back in his chair, regarding these entries with an expression that mingled regret and recognition. He had done what he could, within the limits of his authority and resources, anonymous assistance delivered through channels that protected both giver and recipient from embarrassment. It had not been enough, of course. It had never been enough. But it had been something, and in the moment, something had seemed better than nothing. The door to his office opened without preliminary knock, and Miss Cole entered, her cheeks flushed from the cold, her expression suggesting she had come on a matter of some urgency. "Mr. Finch," she said without preamble, "I must speak with you. I have spent a sleepless night wrestling with my conscience, and I find I can no longer remain silent." "Please," he said, gesturing to the visitor's chair, "I am entirely at your disposal." She sat, though her posture suggested she might spring up again at any moment. "You have been making inquiries about the Brennans. The whole town is beginning to whisper about it, though they pretend otherwise. I need you to understand something, Mr. Finch. The story they tell themselves, the comfortable narrative in which the Brennans simply chose to leave, it is not merely inaccurate. It is a deliberate construction, built piece by piece to absolve everyone of responsibility." "I have begun to suspect as much," Mr. Finch said gently. "It started innocently enough," Miss Cole continued. "After they left, people naturally asked questions. Where had they gone? Why so suddenly? And because no one knew the answers with certainty, they began to speculate. Perhaps the family had family elsewhere. Perhaps James had found employment in another town. Perhaps they had never truly needed assistance in the first place." She paused, gathering herself before continuing. These speculations were comforting, you see. They suggested that Briarcombe bore no blame for the departure. And as time passed, these comfortable speculations hardened into accepted facts. I heard Mr. Lyle declare with perfect confidence that the Brennans had prospered in Manchester, though he had not a shred of evidence for this claim. I heard Mrs. Grant speak of their leaving as though it had been a choice rather than a necessity. And you said nothing to correct these accounts? Miss Cole's face crumpled slightly, as though the question had struck at the heart of her own guilt. I did at first, but I learned that people do not thank you for disturbing their comfort with inconvenient truths. They looked at me with pity, as though my grief had distorted my memory. They suggested, ever so gently, that perhaps I remembered events differently than they saw had occurred. And eventually I grew weary of fighting against the tide. I withdrew into my own remembrance and let them have their stories. Mr. Finch rose from his desk and crossed to the window, looking down upon the high street where morning commerce had begun its daily dance. Shopkeepers swept their stoops, customers moved from door to door, the baker's boy delivered his rounds. All of it proceeding exactly as it always had, a town functioning smoothly because it had agreed not to examine the foundations upon which it rested. "We are none of us villains," he said at last. "That is perhaps the most troubling aspect of this entire affair. Mr. Lyle genuinely believes in prudent stewardship. Mrs. Grant genuinely wishes to serve the community's welfare. Reverend Hart genuinely counsels according to principles he holds sacred. Yet somehow the collective result of all these genuine good intentions was the abandonment of a family in desperate need." "Yes," Miss Cole said quietly, "that is exactly the horror of it. No single person bears the weight of deliberate cruelty. Yet, cruelty was accomplished nonetheless, and because the responsibility is diffused among so many, no one feels compelled to answer for it." They sat together in silence for a time, two people who had witnessed the same events yet carried them differently. Outside, the frost was beginning to melt under the strengthening sun, water dripping from eaves and running in small rivulets along the gutters. The new year was settling into its rhythms, indifferent to the old year's accounts. "What will you do?" Miss Cole asked finally. Mr. Finch returned to his desk and placed his hand upon the ledgers that contained Briarcombe's documented history. "I will do what I have always done," he said. "I will keep the accounts honest. And perhaps, when the opportunity presents itself, I will help others see them clearly as well." Miss Cole rose to leave, but paused at the door. "The town will resist, you know. They have invested much in their comfortable narrative. To abandon it now would require admitting they were wrong, and people will endure remarkable discomfort rather than make such an admission." "I know," Mr. Finch said, "but the alternative is to let the lie persist, and lies have a way of corrupting everything they touch, even when they are told with the best of intentions." After she had gone, Mr. Finch sat alone with his ledgers and his thoughts, a small man in a small office, confronting a problem that was neither small nor simple. He had uncovered the truth of what had happened to the Brennan family. The question that remained was what, if anything, could be done about it now, and whether Briarcombe possessed sufficient courage to face its own comfortable fictions. Outside, the New Year's sun climbed higher in the sky, melting the frost and revealing the ordinary world beneath. But some things, once frozen, Mr. Finch reflected, proved more resistant to thawing than mere ice. Chapter 5. Familiar Accounts Comfortably Told. The manner in which a community constructs its collective memory is a curious phenomenon worthy of study. It resembles nothing so much as the building of a house, where each person contributes a brick or timber according to their particular interest and capacity, and where the final structure, though composed of many individual contributions, takes on a character quite distinct from any single element. In Briarcombe, as in countless other towns throughout England, this process of construction had been ongoing for years, and the edifice that resulted was one in which the inhabitants dwelt with considerable comfort. Mr. Finch, whose occupation brought him into contact with a broad cross-section of Briarcombe society, found himself observing this edifice with fresh eyes in the days following his conversations with Mrs. Grant and Reverend Hart. What had once seemed merely the natural accumulation of shared history now revealed itself as something more deliberate, a narrative carefully shaped to preserve certain conclusions while avoiding uncomfortable questions. On the 31st day of December, as the year prepared to yield its place to its successor, Mr. Finch had occasion to call upon Mr. Edwin Lyle, whose drapery establishment occupied a prominent position on the High Street. The shop was doing brisk business, as it always did at year's end, when households took stock of their linens and found them wanting. Mr. Lyle himself could be seen moving among the bolts of fabric with the satisfaction of a man who knows his enterprise to be flourishing. He was a figure of some consequence in Briarcombe, having served on the town trust for more years than most could readily recall. His opinions carried weight in civic matters, and his support for any proposal generally ensured its passage. He was, in short, exactly the sort of person whose account of events would be accepted without excessive scrutiny. "Mr. Finch," he called out upon spotting his visitor, "a pleasure to see you. Come, step into the back room where we might speak without the interruption of commerce." The back room proved to be an office of modest dimensions but considerable orderliness, where ledgers stood in neat rows and samples of fabric hung from hooks like captured butterflies. Mr. Lyle gestured to a chair and settled himself behind a desk, worn smooth by decades of use. "I trust this concerns the trust accounts," he said, his tone suggesting he hoped very much that it did, and nothing else. "Primarily," Mr. Finch agreed, withdrawing his notebook. "Though I confess I have been pondering certain expenditures from some years back, the period when the assembly room received its improvements, and the roads were resurfaced." Mr. Lyle's expression brightened considerably. "Ah, yes, excellent investments those. Transformed the town, I should say. The assembly room had become quite shabby, you know, hardly suitable for the sort of gatherings we wished to host, and the roads were frankly dangerous in wet weather. The funds came from the general assistance account, I believe," Mr. Finch observed, his tone conversational. "They did indeed," Mr. Lyle confirmed without hesitation. "We took the view that improving infrastructure benefited everyone, whereas individual assistance often benefited only a few. It seemed the wiser allocation of limited resources." "There had been a family," Mr. Finch ventured. "The Brennans. I understand they had sought assistance around that same time." Mr. Lyle's face assumed an expression of thoughtful recollection, as though searching memory's distant chambers. "The name sounds vaguely familiar. Yes, I believe there was some discussion of their circumstances, but as I recall they chose to seek their fortune elsewhere before any decision was reached. Unfortunate timing, perhaps, but hardly the town's responsibility if people elect to depart." "They elected to depart," Mr. Finch repeated slowly, as though testing the phrase for veracity. "So I understood it," Mr. Lyle said, his tone suggesting the matter was settled beyond dispute. "One heard they had family in the north, Manchester perhaps, or Liverpool, places where opportunities might be more abundant for a man of enterprise. I always assumed they prospered there." It was, Mr. Finch reflected, a remarkably convenient assumption. It required no evidence, admitted no guilt, and absolved all parties of responsibility. That it might bear no relation to actual events seemed not to have troubled Mr. Lyle in the slightest. Later that same afternoon, Mr. Finch encountered Miss Margaret Cole quite by accident near the church. She was placing flowers upon a grave, her movements slow and deliberate, her face carrying that expression of quiet sorrow which becomes habitual to those who have sustained losses they cannot quite relinquish. "Miss Cole," he said gently, not wishing to startle her. She looked up, and for a moment something flickered across her features, a memory or regret that passed too quickly to name. "Mr. Finn, I'm Finch. You find me engaged in my annual observance. My mother rests here, and I like to bring winter greenery when the year turns." "A lovely sentiment, Mr. Finch said. He paused, then added, "I wonder if I might walk with you a short distance. There is a matter on which I should value your perspective." They walked together along the path that wound through the churchyard, their footsteps crunching on gravel scattered to prevent the frost from making it treacherous. The headstones stood in various stages of weathering, some still legible, others worn smooth by time and rain until the names they bore had become mere suggestions. "I have been learning about the Brennan family," Mr. Finch said at length. "I understand you are acquainted with Mrs. Brennan." Miss Cole's step faltered, then resumed. "I was. Sarah Brennan was perhaps the dearest friend I have ever known. She possessed a gentleness of spirit that this world did not deserve. She left Briarcombe rather suddenly, I am told." "She did not leave," Miss Cole said, and there was in her voice a fierceness that surprised them both. They were driven out by neglect dressed as prudence, by endless deliberations that substituted for action, by good people who found excellent reasons to do nothing. Mr. Finch said nothing, allowing her words to settle in the cold air like snow. "James Brennan lost his position through no fault of his own," Miss Cole continued, her voice quieter now but no less intense. "The shop where he worked failed, and he found himself suddenly without means. They had savings, but savings vanish quickly when there are 3 children to feed. Sarah came to me and I gave what I could, but my resources are limited. We truly believed, that the town would help, that the funds set aside for such purposes would be deployed. But they were not. They were debated," Miss Cole said bitterly, "discussed at great length. Questions were raised about precedent, about fairness, about whether the family had managed their affairs with sufficient prudence, as though poverty were always the result of moral failing rather than misfortune. And while these discussions continued, the Brennans grew thinner and more desperate, and their children went hungry." She stopped walking and turned to face Mr. Finch directly. "Do you know what Sarah said to me before they left? She said she bore the town no ill will, that she understood everyone had acted according to their conscience, that she hoped Briarcombe would prosper, and then she gathered her children and departed in the night like a thief, because she could not bear the shame of staying." "And you never heard from her again?" "I wrote," Miss Cole said. "Many times. The letters were returned unopened. I like to think they moved frequently in search of work, and the letters simply never found them. But in my darker moments, I wonder if perhaps Sarah could not bear to maintain a connection with the place that had failed her so profoundly." They walked on in silence for a time. The sun was setting, painting the western sky in shades of amber and rose, indifferent to the sorrows of those who walked beneath it. "People tell themselves stories," Miss Cole said finally. "Mr. Lyle believes the Brennans went north to prosper. Mrs. Grant believes they chose to leave rather than accept help. The Reverend believes he counselled prudence rather than hard-heartedness. And perhaps these stories allow them to sleep peacefully at night. But I have no such comfort, Mr. I remember what actually happened, and I carry the weight of it still." She bid him farewell and walked away through the gathering dusk, a solitary figure moving among the headstones. Mr. Finch watched her go, thinking about the stories people told themselves and the truth they chose to forget. He thought about Mr. Lyle's certainty, Mrs. Grant's justifications, and Reverend Hart's careful philosophy. And he thought about how prosperity built upon another's suffering might look from the outside exactly like prosperity built upon honest enterprise, and how a community might convince itself that there was no difference between the two. The year was ending. Tomorrow would bring new beginnings, fresh starts, the traditional optimism of January. But some accounts, Mr. Finch reflected, could not be settled by the simple expedient of turning the calendar's page. Some debts persisted regardless of what convenient stories were told about them. He turned homeward as the first stars appeared, carrying with him the growing conviction that Briarcombe's comfortable narrative was about to face a reckoning it had long postponed. Chapter 4. Questions asked gently, if at all. There is a particular art to inquiry which differs markedly from interrogation, and Mr. Oliver Finch had mastered this art through years of quiet practice. Where interrogation announces itself with the force of a constable demanding entry, inquiry slips through the door like an invited guest, making itself comfortable before its true purpose is recognised. It asks questions that sound like conversation, listens to answers that resemble reminiscence, and departs leaving its subjects feeling they have been heard rather than examined. In the days following his encounter at Mrs. Holloway's establishment, Mr. Finch found occasion to exercise this art with several of Briarcomb's more prominent citizens. His position as bookkeeper provided ample justification for such meetings, as the new year approached and various accounts required review, reconciliation, and the preparation of reports that would satisfy both the town trust and those civic-minded individuals who concerned themselves with such matters. It was in this capacity that he called upon Mrs. Helena Grant on the morning of the 29th of December, finding her at home in the handsome residence she had inherited from her late husband. The house stood on a quiet street lined with lime trees, its brick facade warmed by winter sunlight, its windows gleaming with that particular cleanliness which speaks of servants who take pride in their work. Mrs. Grant received him in her morning room, a space furnished with taste and restraint, where watercolours of local scenes hung upon walls papered in a soft green that reminded one of spring meadows. A fire burned cheerfully in the grate, and the tea service laid out upon a low table suggested that Mr. Finch's visit had been anticipated and prepared for. "Mr. Finch," she said, gesturing him toward a chair upholstered in burgundy velvet, "how good of you to call. I trust you have recovered from the exertions of our celebration." "Entirely, madam," Mr. Finch replied, accepting the chair and placing his leather satchel carefully beside it. "Though I must confess the recovery required was more to my peace of mind than to my constitution. I have been turning over certain matters in my thoughts." Mrs. Grant poured tea with practised grace, her hand steady, her expression pleasantly attentive. "Matters concerning the accounts, I presume?" "Partly," Mr. Finch acknowledged, accepting the cup she offered. "Though I confess my thoughts have wandered into territory less numerical and more historical. Your toast at the celebration spoke of those whose sacrifices built our town. It set me to wondering about the particular individuals you had in mind." A shadow passed across Mrs. Grant's face, too brief to be called a frown, but sufficient to indicate that the subject was not entirely welcome. She settled herself in the chair opposite his, and gazed into her teacup as though consulting an oracle. "I meant it in the general sense," she said after a moment. "All who have contributed to Briarcomb's welfare. The founders, the benefactors, those who have given their time and resources to civic improvement." "Of course," Mr. Finch agreed readily. Yet I could not help but notice a certain response in the assembly, as though the words had touched upon something more specific than you intended. Mrs. Grant's composure, which had served her well through countless social challenges, showed the first signs of strain. She set down her cup with a deliberateness that suggested she was choosing her words with unusual care. "Mr. Finch, I have always valued your discretion and your judgment. I wonder if I might speak candidly with you." "I should be honoured, madam." "There was a family," she began, her voice dropping to a register more suited to confession than conversation. "The Brennans. They lived here some years ago. James Brennan was a clerk, I believe, or perhaps he worked in one of the shops. I confess I do not remember the particulars of his employment. His wife was a quiet woman, rather delicate in her constitution. They had children, 3, I think, though memory may deceive me." She paused, and Mr. Finch, recognising the value of silence, waited for her to continue. "They encountered difficulties," Mrs. Grant went on. "Financial troubles, I believe, though again I cannot claim perfect knowledge. There was talk of the town providing assistance. The trust had funds designated for such purposes, and there were those who advocated strongly that these funds should be deployed to help the family through their hardship. But they were not," Mr. Finch said gently. It was not a question. Mrs. Grant looked up, meeting his eyes with an expression that mingled regret and defensiveness. "There were complications, questions about precedent, about whether such assistance might create expectations we could not sustainably meet. The discussions went on for some time, and by the time any decision was reached, the family had already departed. They left quite suddenly, I seem to recall. 1 week they were here, the next they were gone. And no one thought to follow them, to extend the help that had been debate. By then it seemed too late, Mrs. Grant said, and there was in her voice a weariness that suggested this was an old conversation she had conducted with herself many times before. They had made their choice, or so it appeared. We told ourselves they had found better prospects elsewhere, that perhaps our assistance had never been truly necessary, that they would have left regardless. Mr. Finch considered this, turning the information over in his mind like a coin examined for authenticity. And Miss Cole, I understand she was acquainted with the family. Mrs. Grant's expression softened into something approaching sorrow. Margaret was quite close to Mrs. Brennan. They had formed one of those friendships women sometimes do, based more upon sympathy of temperament than similarity of circumstance. When the Brennans left, Margaret took it very hard. She wrote to them, I believe, but received no reply. Or perhaps she received a reply that was itself painful. I do not know. She has never spoken of it, at least not to me. Yet the town prospered after their departure, Mr. Finch observed. Yes, Mrs. Grant admitted, and the word carried a weight of unspoken implication. The funds that might have gone to assist the Brennans were redirected to other purposes. Roads were improved. The assembly room received repairs it badly needed. We told ourselves it was all for the best, that the greatest good had been served. She fell silent, and in that silence Mr. Finch heard all the justifications that had been offered over the years, all the reasonable arguments that had allowed Briarcombe to move forward with a clear conscience. Or what had passed for a clear conscience until a Christmas toast had disturbed the settled sediment of memory. After his visit with Mrs. Grant, Mr. Finch walked to the church, where he had arranged to meet with Reverend Hart on the pretext of reviewing the parish accounts. He found the clergyman in his study, a small room lined with theological works and smelling pleasantly of beeswax and old leather. The Reverend greeted him with genuine warmth, for he was a man who saw in every visitor an opportunity for fellowship. They attended to the necessary business with admirable efficiency, and then, as though the thought had only just occurred to him, Mr. Finch mentioned the Brennan family. Reverend Hart's face assumed that expression of pained sympathy which clergymen cultivate for speaking of life's sorrows. Ah, the Brennans. Yes, a difficult situation. I was newly arrived in Briarcombe when they were here, not yet familiar with all the currents and considerations that govern a community's decisions. You counselled the town trust regarding the question of assistance, Mr. Finch prompted gently. I counselled that we must balance compassion with prudence, the Reverend said, his hands folding together as though in prayer. That we must consider not only the immediate need, but the long-term implications of our actions. I believed then, as I believe now, that sometimes the kindest course is to allow people to find their own solutions, to avoid creating dependence where independence might yet flourish. And did independence flourish for the Brennans? Reverend Hart looked away, his gaze finding the window through which winter light fell in pale streams. I do not know, Mr. Finch. I have often wondered, and I have often prayed that my counsel did not lead us astray, but we cannot always know the consequences of our choices until it is too late to choose differently. Mr. Finch departed the church as afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the high street. He had learned much, and yet the learning had only sharpened the edges of the mystery rather than resolving it. No one, it seemed, had intended harm. All had acted from reasonable motives, weighing considerations that seemed valid at the time. Yet a family had departed in quiet desperation, and a town had learned to remember their leaving as inevitable rather than preventable. And in that gap between what had happened and what people chose to believe had happened, there lay a truth that Briarcombe had not yet confronted. Mr. Finch walked slowly home through the gathering dusk, his breath visible in the cold air, his mind occupied with the question of whether truth, once buried under years of comfortable assumptions, could be excavated without causing the very foundations of community to shift and settle into new and uncertain. Positions. Chapter 3, Glances Exchanged Over Tea. The days that followed the Christmas celebration possessed that peculiar quality which belongs to the period between great occasions, when life resumes its ordinary rhythms, yet cannot quite shake off the memory of what has just passed. In Briarcombe, this interval was marked by a subtle alteration in the usual patterns of social commerce, as though the town had developed a slight limp that affected its gait without preventing it from walking. The weather had turned colder, bringing with it a frost that silvered the rooftops each morning and made the stones of the high street treacherous for those who ventured out before the sun had done its work. Shopkeepers swept their doorsteps with extra vigour, partly from practical necessity and partly, one suspected, from a desire to appear busy and thus unavailable for extended conversation. The postmistress, normally a repository of local intelligence and a willing distributor of the same, seemed to have developed a sudden efficiency that limited her exchanges to the strictly necessary business of stamps and parcels. Mr. Finch, whose duties required him to move about the town with some regularity, became aware of these changes through the accumulation of small observations. A greeting that would ordinarily have led to a 5-minute discussion of mutual acquaintances now concluded after the briefest of pleasantries. Neighbours who had long been accustomed to taking their tea together now discovered prior commitments that prevented such meetings. The grocer, usually garrulous on any subject from the quality of his apples to the state of the roads, weighed out purchases with uncharacteristic silence. It was not that people had become unfriendly, precisely. The forms of courtesy were still observed, the appropriate words still spoken, yet there existed beneath these surfaces a carefulness, as though each person feared stepping upon ground that might prove unexpectedly soft, certain. Names, Mr. Finch noticed, were no longer mentioned. Certain topics that had once been fair game for general discussion were now approached with the caution one might employ when handling objects known to be fragile. On the morning of the 27th of December, Mr. Finch found himself taking tea at the establishment of Mrs. Beatrice Holloway, whose shop served the dual purpose of selling small household goods and providing a respectable location where ladies might gather for refreshment and conversation. Mrs. Holloway, a widow of comfortable means and comfortable proportions, presided over her domain with the benign authority of one who knows that information is a form of currency and should be dispensed with appropriate discretion. The shop was warm, despite the cold outside, heated by a stove that Mrs. Holloway kept burning with an almost religious dedication. 3 small tables, covered in cloths of cheerful pattern, provided seating for perhaps a dozen customers, though on this particular morning only 2 tables were occupied. At one sat Miss Margaret Cole, a lady of middle years whose unmarried state had long since ceased to be a source of speculation, and had become instead simply a fact of her existence, like her fondness for lavender or her skill with watercolours. Miss Cole was taking tea with Mrs. Harriet Price, the draper's wife, a woman whose conversation typically flowed as freely as the Thames at high tide. Today, however, their exchange seemed oddly constrained, marked by those pauses which indicate that speakers are thinking carefully about what ought not to be said rather than what ought to be said. Mr. Finch, having acquired his tea and a slice of seed cake, took a seat at the remaining table and opened the newspaper he had brought for the purpose of providing himself with a plausible occupation. In truth, however, his attention was divided between the columns of print before him and the conversation occurring at the adjacent table, a division made easier by the fact that Mrs. Price possessed one of those voices which carried, despite its owner's best efforts at discretion. "I cannot help but feel," Mrs. Price was saying, her teacup suspended midway between saucer and lips, "that the celebration was perhaps not quite what we have come to expect." Miss Cole, who had been gazing into her own cup as though reading prophecies in the tea leaves, looked up with an expression of carefully maintained neutrality. The decorations were lovely. Mrs. Grant surpassed herself. "Oh, the decorations were beyond reproach," Mrs. Price agreed quickly. And the refreshments, and the music, all of it quite proper. It was rather the atmosphere, if you take my meaning. Miss Cole took a sip of her tea before responding, a delay that seemed calculated to give her time to compose her reply. These occasions can be somewhat unpredictable. One year everyone is merry, the next year slightly subdued. I dare say it depends upon 100 small factors we cannot anticipate. "It was the toast," Mrs. Price said, lowering her voice to a register that paradoxically made it more audible to interested listeners. Mrs. Grant meant well, of course. No one doubts her intentions, but the reference to sacrifices, to those who built the town, it seemed to touch something. I noticed several people looking quite uncomfortable. Miss Cole's hand trembled slightly as she returned her cup to its saucer, a movement so brief that one less observant than Mr. Finch might have missed it entirely. We all make sacrifices of various kinds. It is part of living in community with others. Yes, but some sacrifices are larger than others, Mrs. Price continued, warming to her subject in that way people do when they sense they are approaching territory both dangerous and compelling. And some are not sacrifices at all, but rather abandonments, or so I have sometimes thought. The silence that followed this observation was of sufficient weight that even Mrs. Price seemed to recognise she had ventured too far. She cleared her throat and added, with an attempt at brightness, "Though of course I know nothing of such matters, being a relative newcomer to Briarcombe." Miss Cole, who had lived in the town all her life, smiled with an expression that contained no mirth whatsoever. "We are all newcomers to somewhere, are we not? And all old-timers to somewhere else. It is a matter of perspective." "The Brennans," Mrs. Price said suddenly, as though the name had escaped her lips before she could prevent it. "I remember hearing that name when I first came to Briarcombe. They had a house near the church, did they not? Yet when I inquired about them, I was told they had moved away some years ago." The effect of this name upon Miss Cole was remarkable. Her face, which had maintained its careful neutrality throughout the conversation, suddenly showed every one of her years. She set down her teacup with a firmness that suggested the conversation had reached its natural conclusion. "Yes," she said quietly, "they moved away. It was all a very long time ago, Mrs. Price. Ancient history, as they say." "But you were friends with them, were you not?" Mrs. Price pressed, displaying that unfortunate quality some people possess of not recognising when a subject ought to be abandoned. "I seem to recall someone mentioning that you and Mrs. Brennan were quite close." Miss Cole stood, gathering her gloves and reticule with movements that spoke of barely controlled emotion. "We were acquainted, as one is acquainted with many people in a small town. If you will excuse me, I have remembered an errand that cannot be postponed." She departed with a haste that left Mrs. Price staring after her in bewilderment, and which drew the attention of Mrs. Holloway from behind her counter. Mr. Finch, still ostensibly absorbed in his newspaper, watched through the shop window as Miss Cole hurried down the street, her shawl clutched about her shoulders as though she were fleeing something more substantial than an awkward conversation. Mrs. Price, left alone with her tea and her confusion, turned her attention to the remaining occupant of the shop. "Mr. Finch, you have been in Briarcombe for some years. Perhaps you can enlighten me. Who were the Brennans, and why does mentioning their name seem to cause such distress?" Mr. Finch looked up from his newspaper with an expression of mild surprise, as though he had only just noticed there were others present. "The Brennans? I fear my memory is not what it once was, Mrs. Price. So many families have come and gone over the years. It's difficult to keep track of them all." It was not precisely a lie, this response, though neither was it the complete truth. Mr. Finch remembered the Brennans quite well, as it happened. He remembered their house near the church, remembered the children who had played in its garden, remembered the gradual way in which their presence had faded from the town's consciousness. Like ink exposed too long to sunlight, but he had learned long ago that sometimes the kindest response to a question is the one that acknowledges ignorance, particularly when the truth might prove more painful than helpful. He finished his tea, paid Mrs. Holloway for the refreshment, and stepped out into the cold December morning. The frost still clung to the shadowed places, resisting the sun's efforts to dislodge it. Mr. Finch walked slowly back toward his lodgings, his mind turning over the conversation he'd overheard, adding it to the other fragments of information that had been accumulating since the night of the celebration. Something, he reflected, had been disturbed. Something that Briarcombe had carefully buried and built over, creating foundations that now proved less solid than the town had believed. And he, Oliver Finch, who had always preferred to occupy the margins of life rather than its centre, found himself wondering whether silence was truly the kindest option or merely the most convenient. Chapter 2. The Toast That Fell Awkwardly Silent. The evening of the Christmas celebration arrived with that particular quality of anticipation which attends events long planned and eagerly awaited. The assembly room, transformed by Mrs. Grant's capable direction into something approaching festive splendour, glowed with the light of perhaps 36 candles arranged in sconces along the walls, and in a handsome chandelier that had been borrowed from the church for the occasion. The holly and ivy, carefully twined about the pillars and doorways, released their sharp, clean scent into air already warmed by the press of Briarcombe's most respectable citizens. They arrived in that slow, steady stream which marks a gathering of neighbours rather than strangers, each party greeted by name, coats and wraps collected and attended to, exclamations of pleasure exchanged over bonnets and waistcoats that had been saved for just such an evening. The ladies had dressed with care, favouring deep greens and crimsons that harmonised with the season, while the gentlemen appeared in their Sunday best, their boots polished to a gleam that spoke of domestic effort and marital supervision. Mr. Finch, arriving neither early nor late, took his customary place near the wall, where he might observe without being particularly observed. He had donned his second-best coat for the occasion, the one reserved for events of civic importance, and had submitted to the ministrations of his landlady, who had insisted upon brushing it until the fabric showed not a trace of the day's activities. He accepted a glass of punch from a passing tray, and settled himself with the patient air of one who knows precisely what an evening will contain and finds the prospect entirely acceptable. The Reverend Hart moved through the gathering with his characteristic benevolence, offering words of encouragement here, gentle humour there, his presence serving to remind all assembled that this was not merely a social occasion, but one touched, however lightly, by the sacred nature of the season. He had a gift for making each person feel that their attendance mattered, that the celebration would have been somehow diminished without their particular contribution to the general warmth. Mrs. Grant, resplendent in a gown of burgundy silk that suggested prosperity without ostentation, commanded the proceedings with the graceful authority of one accustomed to organising the efforts of others toward a common purpose. She moved from group to group, ensuring that no guest stood alone, that conversation flowed smoothly, that the musicians understood when they ought to begin and when silence would be more appropriate. The first hour passed in precisely the manner such events are meant to pass. The musicians, seated in one corner, played carols with competent cheerfulness. Plates of refreshment circulated, mince pies still warm from the oven, slices of cake dense with fruit and spice, cheese and bread for those who preferred something more substantial. The punch bowl was replenished twice, its contents having been mixed according to a recipe that the grocer's wife swore had come down through 3 generations, though there were those who suspected she had invented this provenance to add dignity to what was, in truth, a perfectly ordinary combination of wine, brandy, and spices. Conversation rose and fell in comfortable waves. The weather was discussed, as it must always be among English people. The harvest that had concluded some months earlier was pronounced satisfactory. Plans for the new year were mentioned with that mixture of hope and caution appropriate to persons who had learned not to expect too much from fortune. Laughter erupted here and there, usually following some reminiscence or gentle jest, the sort of laughter that binds a community rather than divides it. It was perhaps halfway through the evening when Mrs. Grant signalled for the music to cease and made her way to the small platform that had been erected at one end of the room for the purpose of speeches and announcements. The assembly, recognising that a formal moment had arrived, arranged itself with that shuffling adjustment of position that allows everyone to see while pretending not to have moved expressly for that purpose. Mrs. Grant waited until the room had settled into attentive silence before she spoke. Her voice, trained by years of addressing committees and charitable gatherings, carried clearly without seeming to strain. "My dear friends and neighbours," she began, her smile encompassing the entire assembly, "it gives me the greatest pleasure to welcome you this evening to our annual Christmas celebration. We gather, as we do each year, not merely to enjoy one another's company, though that is surely a blessing, but to mark the close of another year and to give thanks for the many gifts we have received." There were murmurs of agreement, nods of approval. This was familiar territory, and the familiarity brought comfort. "Briarcombe," Mrs. Grant continued, "is more than a collection of buildings and streets. It is a community built upon the efforts of those who came before us, those whose sacrifices and dedication created the prosperity and harmony we now enjoy. I should like, if I may, to propose a toast to those whose contributions have made our town what it is today." She raised her glass, and the assembly followed suit with the rustling sound of fabric and the gentle clink of crystal. It was at this moment, in the space between the proposition of the toast and its completion, that something shifted in the room, a change so subtle that had you asked any particular person to identify it, they would have struggled to do so, yet undeniable in its effect. Perhaps it was the word sacrifices that did it, carrying as it does implications of loss as well as giving. Perhaps it was the phrase "made our town what it is," which invites reflection upon what the town is, and whether that condition is entirely to be celebrated. Or perhaps it was simply that Mrs. Grant's generous intention had inadvertently opened a door through which uncomfortable memories might slip. Whatever the cause, the result was unmistakable. The room, which moments before had hummed with warmth and agreement, fell into a silence that was not quite right. Eyes that had been lifted toward Mrs. Grant now found other objects of interest: the candles, the garlands, the punch bowl. Several of the older guests, whose memories stretched back farther than most, lowered their gazes to the floor. Others smiled, but with a quickness that suggested effort rather than ease. Mrs. Grant, perceiving the change but not understanding its source, completed the toast with perhaps slightly less conviction than she had begun it. "To those whose sacrifices built our town." "To those whose sacrifices built our town," the assembly echoed, and glasses were raised and sipped from, and the ritual was observed in its proper form. Yet the spell had been broken, or perhaps it would be more accurate to say that a different sort of spell had been cast, one that left the gathering feeling somehow exposed, as though a curtain had been drawn back to reveal a view they had all agreed not to notice. Applause followed, as it must, though it seemed to Mr. Finch, observing from his position against the wall, that it lacked the whole-hearted enthusiasm such occasions typically produced. Mrs. Grant, with admirable composure, smiled and gestured for the music to resume, and the assembly, grateful for the permission to move and speak again, returned to its conversations with an eagerness that spoke of relief rather than genuine desire. Mr. Finch set down his glass and moved quietly through the gathering, pausing here to refill someone's punch, there to retrieve a napkin that had fallen to the floor, offering those small courtesies that allow a moment of awkwardness to pass without direct acknowledgement. He said little, asked no questions, but his eyes, had anyone been watching them, betrayed a keen attention to the reactions around him. He noted who would not meet their neighbour's gaze, who spoke too brightly, who had suddenly remembered a prior engagement and was making apologies to leave. The celebration continued, and by the time it concluded some hours later, most would have said it had been a success. Yet as the guests departed into the cold December night, many carried with them a peculiar unease, like a pebble in a shoe that makes itself known with each step but cannot quite be located when one stops to search for it. Mr. Finch was among the last to leave. He helped Mrs. Grant supervise the extinguishing of candles and the collecting of borrowed items, and when she asked him whether he thought the evening had gone well, he replied with perfect honesty that it had been everything such an occasion ought to be. But as he walked home through streets lit by a moon nearly full, his breath making small clouds in the frosty air, Mr. Finch found himself thinking about the silence that had followed Mrs. Grant's toast, and wondering what precisely it was that Briarcamere had agreed so long ago not to remember.